First off, thank you so much, Kate, for the generous introduction and for inviting me here. I'm thrilled to be here. This is my first mixed conference. This campus is gorgeous, and I am just so honored to be here and delivering this keynote to you. And I look forward to the conversations we're going to have over the next few days. I'm very mindful of time now. That kind of scared me, so I actually have my start button here. I'll try to err on the side of brevity, but I'm a bit of a fast talker, and if it gets to be too fast, you'll let me know. So when I founded the Augmented Reality Lab at York University about a dozen years ago, it was a proposition that required $500,000 in equipment and 1,200 square feet, and a $45,000 see-through head-mounted display from Invis. We installed the largest IS-900 tracking system in a fine arts context in the world. And when I took that Invis HMD out of the box, I was amazed that it actually had a terrible field of vision. It had to be tethered with long cables to a massive desktop computer that we later had to develop an entire rigging system for, so that viewers could wander through the space without an assistant holding the cabling like a flower girl at a wedding. It was the first in a very long series of unboxings that provoked a weird mixture of awe and disappointment. Welcome to the future. But now you can have a very similar development capacity in your living room for about $10,000. The $45,000 Invis HMD can now be replaced with a Meta headset or similar for about closer to 300 pounds. And the key features, the custom software we relied upon to create in that spatial storytelling environment, the director's augmented reality toolkit provided all those years ago so generously to me by Blair McIntyre and Jay Bolter at Georgia Tech, and built upon the last version of Macromedia Director with a physics engine, can now largely be found inside software like Unity that you can download right now during this talk for free. Another story of then and now. Around 2000, I visited the Brown VR cave, and it was revelatory. At the time of my visit, I was a newly minted PhD and had spent the previous 4 years working on a dissertation on hypertext, as hypertext, in a software called StorySpace. That early work, building feminist theory, hypertextual heuristics, was an exploration in hypertext of the resonances and productive couplings between digital writing technologies and feminist theories. This was my pre-digital fiction writing life. Implicit in the title was the claim that the process of shaping hypertext was itself a form of feminist theory production, using theory to build a new kind of text which sought a form resonant with the border-crossing narratives and knowledges it sought to explore. Understanding the interface and the text to be co-constitutive of meaning, I struggled at all stages with the choice of interface and with the limitations of code available to me at the time. The argument was constructed through the creation of 17,000 links that basically took 2 full years of painstaking work to craft, mostly at the level of imagination, but also at the level of my fingers. And then, at the moment of truth, my examination, one member of the examination committee insisted I print out the paper version, a maneuver that erased all of my critical work. I'll call this part of the talk the first failure, possibly the foundational failure. It's right here in the introductory section. Now, I did pass, and I'm here, so all's well. But the work itself failed in a profound way. At that time, early days, remember, most readers read nodes and not links. The lexias were understood as the content of the work, and the structure itself, basically what constituted the epistemological intervention, the contours, the conventions, any new ground I'd hoped to break, was largely unintelligible to most of them. I had under-theorized the ways in which my readers, expert readers of linear texts in this case, would experience hypertextual work at that time, and the piece failed to find interlocutors. What did that failure allow me to see? A few things, but the first was this. To console myself, I returned to hypertext as a possible environment for the creation of fiction. And I vowed that I would create an opposite work. 17,000 links? No way. An expectation that readers would explore the work in its totality? Forget it. Character-driven, tables, remember tables? A table of contents. I named it a novella, signaling a rough time investment from the reader, I catered to existing literacies and met people closer to the edge of where I knew they were reading. It was that post-failure piece that actually launched my career, so that's my secret. And that's why I was at Brown University as a visiting writer that day in 2000. Another response to that first rather wrenching failure, I was hungry for resonant practices that would help me to figure out how to go forward with that kind of work, rather than simply produce its opposite. And that's what I found in the university's virtual reality cave. Revelatory. I'd always thought about the sculptural and dimensional qualities of linked node hypermedia. And the leap to space both concretized some of my fondest wishes for the medium. Please let someone understand this constellation of ideas I've made, this galaxy, this cat's cradle, even as it worked in ways very much against some of the great powers of hypertext. What do you mean this point cannot be connected to every other point? Still, I looked at that virtual reality cave and thought, home. And the magic looking glass of failure allowed me to see an alternate universe in which my dissertation had been built for the cave instead. Its arguments more accessible, its form more persuasive, a vision that persisted over many years, eventually resulting in my joining the grant writing team that established the Center for Information Visualization and Data-Driven Design in Toronto, an $11 million venture where I ran the immersive and interactive visualization group for 3 years. Back to 2000. Now, at that time, the great American novelist Robert Coover was running his pioneering writing classes in that cave. A $1 million facility used in the service of well-funded projects. Think models of blood flow to the heart. Coover approached the cave like a radio station, brokering deals for creative writing students to use it at unpopular, unbooked times. That act was an amazing moment for people who love both words and technology. I think he started to do that in the late 90s. But my favorite project from the time wasn't story-driven. Let's see if I've got it here. It was a cave painting app created by a master's student, and it transported me inside a drawing program where I could choose to a brush, painting midair, walking inside a sculpture I created, and critical to much of my later work, shrinking it down, miniaturizing it, scaling it up, walking inside of it. That experience changed the course of my creative life, including, oddly enough, my approach to fiction, where scale is so often the first act of translation I make. My handheld stories becoming room-sized and back again as I think about digital poetics of movement and the body and the story. I'll just show you a little bit of that. So these were some sort of handheld pieces made with computer vision-based augmented reality assigned to markers. And this is when we put it into Unity. All of the worlds sort of lined up, and instead of being handheld, they were spatialized, and then thrown into our tracking system so that now they became room-size environments. So I played a lot with this idea of the miniature world you'd hold in your hand, and then what happens when you're actually inside of these. I might play it just for a second. Are there people in this room who've not experienced any augmented reality? Just a couple? I'll just play a couple of seconds. There are, of course, many different ways that we experience augmented reality, which in its simplest form is a digital overlay, digital artifacts associated with the physical world. And it's sort of got this powerful poetics of a relationship between the real and the digital. In the first lab that I was talking about, you get these very, very expensive systems where you can walk through and have markerless AR. But the ones you might be more familiar with are sort of on the iPad, or that have, in the early stages, black and white markers, and later computer vision technologies that enable the camera to recognize an object and then overlay. So a lot of the iPad apps, Pokemon Go, that's kind of work. I'll just run a second or so of a very early Flash-based piece that was originally part of these handheld. Oh, but I don't know if I've got the audio on. It's not critical. It's more just suggestive.
Arrived in borrowed coaches, wearing ill-fitting wigs, quarter breeches, hand-me-down albums. All are known to us. Now, black as the bells, the doors of the abbey are closing. Pray take your seat.
It's okay. I'll just go through. So part of it is that these were sort of created on a dime.
God's voice rises like incense.
Easy architectures. You could have them on very inexpensive PC computers. We did these a lot for school children. You just had to print out a piece of paper and have a web player with a camera going, and you could experience early AR. And we also created these as sort of easy, creative architecture sets where you could just replace that's basically one 3D model and a series of image planes, and you could just create your own audio. So they were sort of kits for creating your own AR worlds. No, I think it'll be okay. And in any case, so all of these different things were made from one kind of model. I'll move through with that. So thinking about digital poetics of movement and the body and the story and about how long it took to get me there. And now my children, your future readers, play with Google Tilt Brush on the HTC Vive in their rooms. These are now sort of domestic possibilities to create very similar situations to the cave painting. The technology then has changed dramatically, as has access. We know this. We also know that the creative challenges never change quite so much or as quickly. And we still, as writers working with newer technologies, walk that electrifying line between pleasure and jouissance, pushing audiences and developing new literacies, and the line of incremental work that doesn't really rise to the challenges of new affordances, risking making audiences wonder why we bothered. And as cool as it is, Tilt Brush in many ways still hasn't caught up to the year 2000 and failure to develop shrink capacity, but it will. So that's the bulk of the looking back part of the talk, to go with the conference theme of reflection with a touch of regeneration. And now we'll turn maybe not exactly to revolution, but to a series of more recent failures that will allow me to signal in miniature some of the things I've learned in the augmented reality lab that might just be of use to you as you work in your own labs and living rooms and with cognate machines of the near future, and perhaps to your own revolutionary practices. So here we go. Failure of technology to deliver. My high expectations for technology are regularly disappointed, as I've suggested. But I learned a comforting key lesson very quickly, that in an emerging field like augmented reality storytelling, even with the best equipment, ideas and creativity always outstrip our technical capacity, and that those of us working in emergent areas do best understanding our projects as beta tests for a future at least a decade out, maybe two. Sure, the optical see-through display might be tethered. Who cares? The better question is this: why don't you want it to be? What happens when it isn't? And what happens to your stories? And that incredibly expensive tracking system? Military accuracy, sure, but experiences we built for that room could never be shared with people outside of it. Sometimes only a handful of people saw projects that were the culmination of months, sometimes years of work. The most extensive AR piece ever created at that time. An original translation of Wojciech with room-scale AR theatrical immersion by then MA student Rebecca Rouse, now a faculty member at Rensselaer. This was really a 2-year project, and I think probably a dozen people saw it and was brilliant. 3 years worth of worlds created by successive classes in graduate future cinema that entered dream and defied physics as they worked in conversation with Italo Calvino's Invisible Cities. Haunted houses of all sorts, found footage experiments, AR theremins, poetry hotels, story cubes, puzzles, fortune tellers. And I don't have time to show you a lot of documentation, but of course, in the tracking system, this is our AR theremin, it could absolutely be invisible, and it could be filled with, of course, musical notes, but also small snippets of poetry, stories. We turned this into apartments. The reason it's visible there is because people were embarrassed to kind of go through and search for the theremin, so we sort of provided spaces. And we had some beautiful projects for that. Students in the early days when we had a lot of fiducial-based AR, did a lot of puzzles, weird little maquettes, small rooms that could be explored with those old USB cameras, Legos. We had early voice recognition here.
1,
Failure.
2.
There, success.
3, 4.
Anyway, you see. It was a failure of dissemination. I never thought then about archiving these early experiments properly, and they can never now be restaged. The tracking equipment came down 2 years ago, and that's not really a sad thing. It's because the technology has changed so much that it's actually easier to create. I can create in many room-sized environments without having to be fixed in that particular location. Even at the time, we lamented the small audience, the limitations of working in that lab. But beyond the failure, questions for the future. What will this look like, I'd ask my students, when these stories, propelled by this magic physics engine, leave the lab? And they will. How will they exist? How will they change? I tell my students all the time, not so much to reduce expectations as to bracket them, to leverage failure of both technology and our own capacity to expand, rather than see it as a reason to reduce the feature wish list we have in our heads, even as we reduce it for the conference or exhibition or submission to the App Store. This is also the great privilege and responsibility of working within the context of a public university, rather than working with the very different pressure of getting things immediately to market. The failure of the $45,000 headset to impress me utterly, nevertheless, could not dissuade me. It worked brilliantly enough to give me confidence in the fact that I could write stories for immersive systems. And when AR hit handheld, I made things for it. Of course I did. That's where the audience was, and that was the dissemination opportunity. But I understood then, as now, the handheld as an intermediary form. Having learned lessons from the NVIS, I'm confident in a more immersive future, one that will one day have a life outside the lab. I could see it before I could make it. And in that very Nietzschean sense, the machines had already worked on my thoughts, and I was changed. Another story. Oh, here are just a few more of the handhelds. I do like them. I worked for a long time against them. I'll just leave it there. Sorry, I'm standing in the wrong place. Another story. Film students used to come to the lab with their new footage from RED cameras, utterly gorgeous, excitedly imagining what I know now to be a fairly common dream among film students of creating galaxies of moving image screens within which to wander. At that time, augmented reality was largely considered the poor cousin to the more dazzling VR. Though understanding the power of the relationship between the physical world and the digital, I never bought that. But AR certainly didn't have the infinite canvas of VR at that time, and the tools were different. It was much harder to generate multiple screens that way. I would look at those students and tell them to reduce the quality of their clips until they couldn't stand it and come back, and then reduce them some more. Even then, the system mostly crashed. Sometimes we succeeded in placing a dozen or so moving images in the AR world, often managing by only having them active when the viewer was nearby, so we could save computational power. And you know what? In the earliest successful experiments, wearing that expensive HMD and having the capacity to see films floating in space, most of the early viewers would hold tight to their glasses and fix the floating screen to the wall. Just like TV, better, done. The return of the failure to meet the audience in the right place. It was actually very, very weird. We would have screens everywhere finally, and it was just so weird watching people try to pin them so that it was a familiar viewing practice. And I think a fear among audiences of doing things correctly, sort of like the theremin. Nobody wants to sort of go around there. Nobody wanted to walk through in those early days through these digital screens. But I never forgot what the film students wanted, constellations of moving stories. So we stopped using those frames and began to imagine a better and more immersive world even before we got the hang of the green screen or found someone interested in 3D modeling. We understood that world before it was possible to truly craft one. So working in my AR lab then is basically a sustained game of let's pretend. Pretend the headset isn't tethered. Pretend the field of vision is good. Pretend we can take this outside. Pretend the software is still being updated. Pretend your readers can inhabit this for 10 hours while you improve the story. And of course, we pretend more literally. All stones have fairies and haunted objects. And I've come to love the tension between the Olympian constraint of the current tech, the need to have something working by deadline, versus the expansive sandbox, the seduction of dreaming a decade or so into the future. And the constraint and sandbox work iteratively, too, to change our understanding of what digital storytelling can be. The creative act is always ahead of the tools, but at its best, this relationship is iterative, respectful of the powerful creativity that can be embedded within the tools, too. So let's have a faster list of failures and their productive consequences. Failure to renovate in time, combined with a failure to drag and drop into XYZ space. We got this room, and actually, by the time my university had assigned me this incredible space, it's going to be renovated, I was able to have a baby and take an entire year off and return, and it was still under construction. So our dream of instantly dragging and dropping into the room size object resulted in a bit of a turn where we moved at that time to the very inexpensive paper base. So that was kind of crazy, the $600,000 lab and the $10 solution, creating some very, very easy drag and drop software. And I spent a lot of time thinking about what happens when we reduce barriers to entry. Not there. Our early drag and drop Snapdragon software was designed. Oh, I'll let her just go. That's my daughter Harriet, who grew up making augmented reality houses.
If you click next scene, you can get a different picture.
All right, we'll just go in there. In any case, that was also just kind of a screenshot of the early software that we used. And I often would run like 1-hour workshops so that people who came in with no program experience and just a few clips would be able to leave with fully completed projects. So I thought a lot about what happens when we reduce barrier to entry. AR is a tool for children. And the miracle of that software isn't that it was the best, but that it was the easiest. And long after we had access to more sophisticated tools with more sophisticated properties, we still used it to prototype. The drag and drop that we were using there was just for 2D film clips and sound, but here's another lab secret. It was only an IP issue that prevented us from distributing 3D drag and drop a decade ago. And I think that would have made a big difference in digital humanities projects to have that kind of easy access. And there were also wonderful in-house experiments with variations on the software, playing with how the camera understood proximity. So as the marker gets closer, of course, the area is larger, so we could use that to increase sound. But it also meant that the camera can tell when markers were coming in proximity. So you could actually have a collision of stories. So marker A, the girl, meets marker B, the farmhouse. Together, they create the fire. This became a really interesting prototyping tool for long-form interactive narratives. Here's another failure. And this was a big one. The failure to fix persistent audio. So here's another one of the secrets promised in my title. I'm pretty convinced I won an award once, largely owing to software failure. When we were developing that software, the computer vision-based augmented reality, it functions by seeing the pattern, as I've said, and in this case, we were overlaying it with digital artifacts. This was a found object, a children's pop-up book, and I was overlaying it with a series of stories about women named Isabel, and the piece was called Andromeda. One of the things, though, as we approached the deadline for this contest, I could not get the camera to unsee the marker. So once audio had started, it just kept going. And about 10 minutes to deadline, I was just like, forget it. And I filed it, and it won. And what I'm thinking is, my poems generally err on the side of the lyric, and the digital poets aren't generally into that. So the winning compromise was a lyric personal poem that sounded much more experimental than intended. So I'll show you this from 2008. Totally not on purpose.
like times like these, full of regret. I see where the stars rattle and resist. Wasn't for me. At times like these, full of regret. I see where the
You get the idea. Another failure. One of the great engineering problems in augmented reality is the challenge of positioning digital assets correctly in the real world, aligning people in their chairs, signs with their reference, the registration problem. Working in a fine arts lab and having no comparative advantage in solving this problem, we embraced the failure to register. While we often simply overlaid images in a loose mixed reality experience, so maybe think again of like something like Pokemon Go, where the Pokemon is fun to have it in your cereal bowl or wherever, it's not actually mapping the world. We went all in too. With the failure of great tracking came the inventions of tiny worlds, the miniature. Fire coming right through the book, uncontained. If I had no capacity to actually put a person next to Kate in the chair, I just made everything smaller and put lots of people. So it's a great workaround. Another failure. When the iPad came out, I was very keen to use the affordances of the touch screen. What an elegant solution to require only a single AR marker that would trigger a 3D model. So if you think about some of the earlier images I showed, like all those black and white squares, or a dozen of them attached to Legos, or that whole world, we were generating a lot of these stories with multiple markers. Once we had natural feature detection and the iPad, what was possible was to have just one image that could trigger this entire sort of universe, and being able to touch the screen would give you access. So it was a big change. It was very exciting for me, and it was an utter failure. So it was triggering a 3D model, in this case, a model standing in for a French chateau that could be explored area by area with the touch of a finger. Wooded areas, cemeteries, all visually signaled with different zones. So this is how you were able to see that all of those must be stories. You could hold it up, you could access it. The geography of stories was obvious and irresistible, except it wasn't. And in beta testing at that time, and recall that these were early years for touch screens, not a single reader progressed to any of my small stories. Not one. Standing instead just looking at the model. One or two of the testers pronounced the story great, having experienced absolutely none of it, which of course suggests something about failure in beta testers. So let's see. The testing failure made me rethink. My short-term solution was to make the project more like a book, a series of images that could be turned, a text of pleasure, catering to existing readers. But it also made me invested in the near future form of better interactivity in AR. In both AR and VR experiments over the following years, I never again made the assumption that readers or viewers would know how to interact. So this is actually where it ended up, where each of the stories was associated with a page in a book, and it made this spatialized castle a very linear series of works.
Rule number 1. No one will ever be where you saw them last, even if you only saw them 10 seconds ago, even if you said, wait right here. Let me tell you my preferred version of the story. A storyline which doesn't involve my throwing up on the Grey Goose duvet, the 18th century marble dresser, my peach nightgown, throwing up even into the eyelets of the pillowcase, onto the exact patch of floor I stepped to shakily the next morning. Let's promote some bloody tantric wake-up ritual, like hypnosis. Let's stay here forever, Beatrice. God.
So that was actually, that piece was called 200 Castles, and it was sort of a series where it was sort of this palimpsest of multiple centuries and stories in the same physical space. And it was interesting to have to turn that into a book. But the lesson I learned from that resulted in some questionable design decisions, like giant teardrops over active areas in my early VR piece, Cardamom of the Dead. I really do regret it because it was really very ugly. But it did show people where they could access stories. Being a research lab, I'm pretty gentle with myself when it comes to production values. My work is generally distributed free and pushing against the boundaries of ideas, where story meets interface rather than pure tech, but it was ugly. On the other hand, people at least knew where they were supposed to go in the world and what parts of the landscape could contain stories, and a rough sense of the scale of the story world, something I'm very mindful of when I ask people to engage with my work now. What kind of time am I expecting them to spend? Failure to understand HCI, another failure. This particular piece was way too big for that development moment. It was built for the first development version of Oculus, and with a rough time of about an hour and a half of spoken word material. Then there was music, wandering, spatialized ambient audio, a rough linking via both thematically linked portals and randomized doors, revisiting the idea that the piece would take a long time. And I was excited to find in VR that each point could be connected to any other point again. I wondered if it would be satisfying. It was utterly the wrong question. I should have been wondering if anyone could stay in the work more than 10 minutes without being sick. And there's poor Catherine Hales, one of the great figures of electronic literature, being sick. No, I think she was a very, very good sport, but it was terrible. But the impulse, I believe, was correct, because even just a few years later, people can inhabit these spaces for a lot longer. And I know that the moment in VR right now is really to experiment with, point of view and to create these gorgeous immersive experiences. I'm very interested in all that kind of work. One of the things I'm doing in October is I'm a juror for the Chelsea Film Festival. And actually, I'll pitch that right now. There's a call, especially for emerging works, for new voices to be working in virtual reality. It's a very, very interesting opportunity. So I think there's room for all different kinds of work in VR. But one of the things I don't really see very much are fiction writers and novelists thinking about VR. And I think that is partly because of this problem of scale, of staying in it, and of moving people through. So this was a failure, but I still think there's something right about the vast canvas of virtual reality for fiction, large novels. And so I didn't turn away from this at all. Actually, one of the things that I learned from this project was that it was worthwhile still doing another intermediary version, and we did a virtual reality translation of author Richard Ehrlich's book, Sheila Carpenter's. And again, it's a very long piece, partly on rails, where you just kind of sit on like an amusement park ride, partly a sandbox where you can go and experiment. And it doesn't just contain the narrative backbone of sort of a political fable. It contains 30 years worth of visual archives that he'd created as a journalist in Southeast Asia. So I'm thinking that even though the form might not be there yet, it is one of the forms for the future. Another one, the failure of GPS. Oh, hang on. That's part of that VR piece. Whoops. Failure of GPS. The drift, the great distances, the wrong density for strong stories. It's still really imperfect. And I'm sorry if you adore it, but I do not yet. But I still think it's irresistible and amazing. And because I found existing mobile media so promising, but largely unsatisfying, I put my energy into a new collaboration to advance expressive tools and in situ storytelling. And I'm currently working with Steve Mann, largely considered to be the father of wearable computing, and Metaspace Glass to imagine new possibilities for augmented reality storytelling, both long-form fiction and something we might consider its opposite, the stories all around us like light and Wi-Fi and brain waves, something Steve has named phenomenological augmented reality, using AR to see the unseen. So that's sort of the double movement in our project. Just to give you a sense of so being able to use the tools of augmented reality, so in this case, seeing the crazy surveillance equipment inside the bear. And of course, we're walking all the time. One of the great things that we forget about when we approach these as creators is that, of course, we are constantly under surveillance. I was thinking about that a lot coming to the UK. So being able to see all of the cameras embedded, the swimming pools, just in case you might want to see the cameras that are all available in the washroom. So we've been thinking about this a lot too, and using it for stories, imagining something like a phenomenological augmented reality theater. being able to play games, being able to do different activities. Largely to see the unseen. The other thing I'll say as a side note, one of the consequences of this kind of research, and I think in some ways our failure to really theorize and act upon the idea that we're in a surveillance society, is that Steve has started to craft a collective augmented reality Bill of Rights where people can talk about what it means to be captured, what it means to, and this sort of was emergent when people were talking about Google Glass as well. What does it mean to be filmed? What does it mean to be captured all the time? So we're original signatories to that augmented reality Bill of Rights, and I would urge you to check it out. So over the past 3 years, we've worked to create narratives that are persistent, active, and collaborative, and writing tools that can be used while within the environment. So again, think almost about the tilt brush. Storyscapes set in the real world through which the audience can wander over a long period of time. Lots of failures, and not done yet, but the right path, I think. It's obvious that when things are difficult and time-consuming to make, that the tendency will be for the finished work to be shorter. There will also be a lack of iteration, not so very many drafts before throwing in the towel. When tools are easier, when it's effortless to change and undo mistakes, the work isn't necessarily better, of course, but it's more likely to be extensive. When you can create inside the environment itself, you and your audience may spend more time in it. And when it's collaborative, it changes many of the rules of fiction writing. You lose so much authorial control, but it does open up many new possibilities. One future somewhere between providing a strong narrative backbone along freer spaces, rails and sandbox. So we've necessarily spent a lot of time creating the conditions for writing rather than completing the work that I'd imagined would be ready to beta test at this point. But there have been successes too, glimpsing future stories that just did not seem possible even a few years ago. Like the cave painting shrink machine that changed my life. The thing that changed all the rules for me again is being in a networked meta environment and being able to create a digital object. And if you're wearing the headset and on the same network as I am, being able to transport it to you and you can receive it. And that's the beginning of science fiction. And it's an old exquisite corpse. Less poetically, it's a future of product design, but it's a challenge to storytelling in very many ways. And it's actually really, really magical. What else does failure allow us to see? In the context of my current project, I want to return to the idea that the creative act is almost always ahead of the tools, but that there's a potent relationship we can harness between tools that work just well enough to frustrate and our imaginative capacity. Steve was recently in China, where there's a great will to harness that relationship between technology and imagination. And to that end, they're building him labs, maybe even a town. Think about it, an entire town devoted to creativity, the investment oriented to that cusp of poetry and science. And you don't need to own hardware to harness this power, not even at the $10,000 mark. Purchase titles, borrow headsets, be frustrated by GPS poetry, even play Pokemon Go. Read and experience widely and develop your own catalog of failures to jumpstart your imagination. You don't need to wait to build your own AR world to have an opinion about possible futures for this form. Make lists and paper prototypes. If the world had a magical overlay and the laws of physics didn't apply, and they needn't, what would you make and add? If your story could exceed the standard bounds of film time and the bindings of a book, spill into the street, could be any scale, a combination of passive and expressive tools for your audience, balance wherever you like between crowd-pleasing and jouissance, leverage the storytelling capacity of the physical space, libraryness, the city at night. That moment is almost now. The technology isn't quite there yet, but almost. And in some situations, and for some sophisticated audiences, yes, it's here. My best advice for you approaching development in augmented reality, especially as it becomes mobile, collaborative, and an expressive as well as receptive art form, is to close your eyes and feel the coming magic. Whatever you want in that space, spoken word poem fragments, 2D or 3D, fantastical Lilliputian armies, blue haze, musical staircases, 1,000 palimpsests. Close your eyes. What genre? Detective fiction, young adult, creative nonfiction, poetry, erotica, memoir, something without a name yet. Think of all the ways you would want to interact with that kind of work. Would you want to pick up objects? Hold up a phone as a magic looking glass? Wear low-key goggles, contact lenses, naked eye? Do you want stories triggered as you approach? What kind of equipment? What kinds of boundaries would be signaled, if any, between the real world and the digital? Rails or sandbox? Links or portals? Imagine the limit case, your best possible world. The story you will create that is so compelling people don't want to leave. What is its scale? Can it be changed? Its granularity? Will people wander in it for days, hours, a solitary experience or a collective? Fixed in time and published or evolving? Tell me your perfect story. That's the secret to imagining both machines and fictions of the near future into being. Because in the short term, my guess is the project will fail along multiple dimensions or won't be built at all. The tech isn't quite ready for the most sophisticated stories. We, your readers, maybe aren't ready yet, but remember their children playing with the HTC Vive in their bedrooms. In the long term, it's storytellers in all genres with prescient visions and an understanding of meaningful and compelling content that will lead tool building and hardware production. So I'd like to reassure you, if you're here in this room, that you're on a pretty level playing field with million-dollar labs. Because the most important moment in the workflow, the truly revolutionary one, remains in augmented reality and pretty much everywhere else too. Thinking a decade ahead, closing your eyes, and playing Let's Pretend. Thank you.